Deadwood, the movie, television film made by HBO, serving as a conclusion to the 3-season show, also called Deadwood. A conclusion that seems fairly late, as it was made over 10 years after the show was cancelled. Back then it was obvious that the ending of the third season was not definitive, that there was more to the story, and so the final episode left many of the fans wanting. And apparently there had initially been a handshake deal made between the showrunner and one of HBO's producers to make a movie straight away. But before they could get to that executive from HBO was arrested for assaulting his girlfriend, and it all fell apart afterwards. And finally in 2018 the film was actually made and premiered in 2019. Most of the original cast returned, save for a couple of people who couldn't, and a couple more who passed away in the meantime, most notably Powers Booth. So the movie opens 10 years after the final episode. Calamity Jane returns to Deadwood after what we assume was years of traveling to reconnect with Jeannie Stubbs. And there is another thing going in the camp as well. There are celebrations of the statehood of South Carolina going on, which brings other notable people back, including Alma Ellsworth and Hearst, who is now a senator. And his coming back will inevitably open old wounds between the ruthless businessman and the camp's important figures, Marshal, Seth Bullock, and Al Swearengen, the proprietor of the Gem Saloon. So it's definitely a movie directed specifically at fans of the show. If you haven't seen it, then you won't really connect with it, I think. Even though it uses a couple of flashback scenes to explain who's who and some major events from the past. Even so, it does build on 3 seasons worth of character exploration and development, and pays off some long-standing arcs, tying them up. So I still maintain that you have to have seen the show to really enjoy the movie as well. Now I have, and my verdict is that whilst it was certainly good to wrap up some of the storylines and reconnect with old characters who have all aged quite noticeably, there is still a lingering feeling that it's way too late. Because what was the main strength for me in Deadwood, the show, was the power dynamic in the camp, specifically revolving around Al Swearengen, played fantastically by Ian McShane. I always thought that Timothy Olyphant's Bullock was not really the main character, even though you would assume he's like the typical protagonist. He was more of a foil, a sometimes ally and sometimes antagonist to Swearengen, someone that kept him somewhat in check. But Swearengen was still at the center of most major events, orchestrating many of them and trying to spin his web of influence so that he could always come out on top. And also he was, as an extension of that, he was always far more interesting as a character because he skirts the line between good and evil so often. And you can see those conflicting forces within him. So having that in mind, it is a bit disappointing that in the movie he's not really his old self. He's old and frail and sick, and I don't know how much of that was just storytelling and how much was the real age and condition of Ian McShane, hopefully only the former. But with him not being so prominent anymore, so out there, so at the forefront of the story, it does feel much inferior, much more subdued to what compared to what we've seen before. Although interestingly enough, you know, with the statehood coming in and the telephone lines being laid out in camp, you could read it as Al passing slowly into the past along with the frontier as it was. Now with law and order and progress and governments fully coming in, there is simply no place for a man like him in this new world. There's certainly an element of that in the movie's themes, but it doesn't overshadow the fact that there is noticeably less flair, less humor and spark in the plot and in the dialogue especially because of that shift. Overall though, it's still decent as a conclusion. I think it will be easier to let the show rest with it than without it, seeing as it was cut short with pretty much all of the plot lines unfinished. Now, after the movie, I think we at least get some closure.